In this section, we're looking at nonlinear inequalities. So for example, we have x squared minus x minus 20 is less than 0. We're going to find the values for x where this is true. First, let's start off by factoring. As far as this quadratic goes, I can factor it into x minus 5 and x plus 4. Now what that does is that gives us some critical points. So if we're thinking about this on a number line, for example, here's 0, so we're looking at positive 5 and a negative 4 as our critical points within this problem. So we have these different areas that we're looking at. I'm looking in between here. I'm looking at all the values that direction and all the values that direction. So what we can do is pick some values that fall into each of these. Excuse me, that's a negative 4 right there. So for example, if I plug in a negative 5 for this area from negative 4 that direction, and if I plug in a 0, and if I plug in a 6, what I can find is this true or not? So we have, for example, if I plug in negative 5, that'd be negative 5 squared minus a negative 5 minus 20. And that is equal to 10. And we know that 10 is not less than 0. So no, that is not going to work. If I plug in 0, so I have 0 squared minus 0 minus 20, well, that's equal to negative 20. We do know that negative 20 is less than 0, so yes, that does work. And if I plug in 6, I'd have 6 squared minus 6 minus 20. If we put all that together, that's going to be equal to 10 again. 10 again is still not less than 0, so no, that does not work. So what that's really saying then for this particular problem, again, if I think of it on a number line, is that from negative 4, and I use parentheses because that value is not included. Remember, this said less than 0, not less than or equal to. From negative 4 to 5 for my x values, that this would be true. So on a number line, we're saying here's my negative 4, here's my 5, and we're going in between those. So that'd be an open circle because those numbers aren't included, and it would be everything in between. So all the values from negative 4 to 5 would make that quadratic inequality true. Now, we can also look at if I have 3x cubed minus x squared minus 12x is greater than negative 4. Now, first of all, with these inequalities, we want to set them equal to 0, so I'm going to add that 4 over to this side. So we have 3x cubed minus x squared minus 12x plus 4 is greater than 0. And from here, what I want to do is I want to be able to find some zeros. I can do some factoring. Maybe I can factor by grouping and simplify it that way, or I can do use the graphing calculator, but I need to find my zeros to find those critical points. I plugged in the equation into the calculator, and it looks like I have zeros at negative 2 and positive 2, and then somewhere in between 0 and 1. So I'm going to pick one of those values, do synthetic division, and try and factor this. I did the synthetic division. I used 2. Remember, that drops down. I multiply 2 times 3 to get 6, and then I add those, and I multiply and add. It does come out to 0, so 2 is one of my zeros. And this also gives me 3x squared plus 5x minus 2 to be another factor there, and then I can factor that. I'm going to get a 3x minus 1 and x plus 2, that's plus 2, as my other two factors. So that gives me all three of my zeros, 2, negative 2, and 1/3. So then those are our critical points. So if I'm looking at that, what I'm looking at on a number line, then I can have my 0. Let's see, we've got 1/3 is a critical point, and then I've got 2 is a critical point, and I have negative 2 as a critical point. So I'm looking in between these values, and I want to pick some numbers then to plug in. So for example, if I plug in negative 3, I can plug in 0 as my critical point in between these values, plug in 1 in between these two, plug in 3 for the other side, and I'm going to plug those in and see if they work or not. So I've plugged in those values, -3, 0, 1, 3, work this out, and we see here -50 is not greater than 0, so no, it doesn't work on that end. 4 is greater than 0, so when I plug in 0, that does work. Those give me solutions that work. -6 is not greater than 0, so those values in there do not work. When I plug in 3, 40 is greater than 0, that's true, so these values do work. So what we end up with is any of the values in between -2 and 1/3 are going to be solutions for this. In addition to anything greater than 2 is going to be in addition. So that's where we can use a union symbol and say, hey, I have all these that make this true, and I have all these values that make this true. And if we go back to our graph, and if we're looking there, what we're really saying here is, where are these values greater than 0? Well, look at the graph, and I can even zoom out a little bit. I'm going to adjust that window and go from -100 to 100, count off every 25 units. And what we're saying is that when I look at these values here, they're positive, and then of course everything going up this direction is positive. That's where that would be true.